The invitation came as a text message from my father, brief, polite, as though sent to an acquaintance. Join us at the lake house this weekend. The guys are coming. No explanation, no warmth. Just an opportunity wrapped in obligation that I hadn't been there since I was a child. The lake house existed in my mind as a quiet blur, pine trees, the smell of wet earth, and my father's laughter drifting over the water, always shared with someone else, never with me. Yet, for reasons I couldn't name, I said yes. The drive north took 3 hours. The road narrowed into a single lane flanked by whispering trees. When the house came into view, it stood half hidden by mist rising off the lake, its old timber walls dark with age. My father was already outside, a glass in his hand, the kind of drink he always poured before 5. He smiled when he saw me, but it was the kind of smile that stopped before reaching his eyes. "You made it," he said, clapping my shoulder with more force than affection. Inside, laughter rolled through the wooden beams, low, familiar voices that carried history I wasn't part of. My father's friends filled the space like they owned it. Mark Ellison was the first to greet me, tall and composed, his shirt rolled at the sleeves, revealing strong, sun-browned arms. He had the calm, steady voice of someone used to being listened to. "Ethan, right?" he said, his handshake firm. "Haven't seen you since you were, 10? David Lane followed, smiling easily, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "You've grown. Your dad talks about you sometimes." "Does he?" I asked before I could stop myself. David only chuckled, like he knew more than he should. The last was Tom Calder, shorter, louder, with an energy that filled silence before it could breathe. "The prodigal son returns," he shouted, slapping my back. "Grab a beer before your old man drinks them all." I laughed, though it came out awkward. My father laughed too, but it was directed at them, not me. Evening fell slowly, the lake turning to glass under a bruised sky. The air smelled of smoke and cedar. Dinner was grilled over open flames, the table heavy with food and stories I couldn't contribute to. The men spoke of college days, failed marriages, jobs lost and found. I listened, half invisible, drinking bourbon that burned too easily. At times, I caught Mark watching me, not in the way of idle curiosity, but with something steadier, like he was trying to read a language he once knew. When he spoke to me, his words were measured, careful. "You look a lot like your dad used to," he said once, his gaze drifting to the fire. "Except you carry your silence differently." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. As the night deepened, so did the laughter. Tom began telling stories too loud for the walls. David joined in, his laughter warm, his hand resting easily on my shoulder when he leaned close to speak. My father sat at the edge of the firelight, content to let them fill the space he refused to occupy. When he finally rose, he patted my arm and said, "Don't stay up too late. We've got work to do in the morning." He didn't wait for a reply. The screen door closed behind him, leaving a thin echo in its wake. For a while, I stayed with the others. Mark poured me another drink, his hand steady, his eyes catching the fire's reflection. "Your father always kept this place the same," he said. "Even the silence hasn't changed." "It's quiet," I said, though I meant something else. "Quiet can be honest," he replied. "It tells you what people try to hide." David laughed softly from across the room. "Mark gets philosophical when he drinks. Don't take him too seriously." But I did. Something about his tone lingered long after the conversation shifted. When I finally excused myself, the hallway felt too long, too still. The boards creaked under my steps. The room I'd been given overlooked the lake, dark water swallowing the moonlight. I opened the window, the night air rushed in, cool and damp. Voices still carried faintly from downstairs, the kind that made you feel included even when you weren't. I heard Mark's low tone, then David's lighter one, then silence. The kind of silence that means everyone has said too much. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember why I'd come. Maybe I wanted to prove something, to my father, to myself. Maybe I wanted to understand him through the people he kept closest. Or maybe, without realizing it, I wanted to see if I belonged in his world at all. The wind shifted, and the lake murmured softly through the open window. Somewhere below, a door opened and closed. Footsteps passed down the hall, slow and unhurried. They paused outside my door, just long enough for me to hold my breath, then they moved on. When I exhaled, the sound felt too loud that I rolled onto my side, the bourbon still warm in my chest, and thought about Mark's words, about silence, and what it reveals. I thought about my father, sitting somewhere below, surrounded by friends who seemed to know him better than I ever did, and I thought about the look Mark gave me across the fire, brief, unreadable, but filled with something that didn't belong to friendship or politeness. The lake house settled into quiet again, but sleep wouldn't come. It wasn't the kind of restlessness born of noise or fear. It was the kind that hums beneath your ribs when you sense something about to change. That I turned off the lamp, the room swallowed by dark. Outside, the water shimmered faintly, catching light from somewhere unseen. That night, the silence didn't feel honest. It felt expectant, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Morning arrived wrapped in mist. The lake looked silver and still, a mirror without reflection. I woke to the faint creak of boards downstairs and the smell of coffee drifting through the hall. For a moment, I didn't move. The events of the night before, Mark's lingering gaze, the quiet tension, hung like fog in my mind. When I finally went down, my father was outside with Tom, both already dressed for chores. David sat at the counter, newspaper spread before him, his bare feet tapping softly on the floor. Mark stood near the window, stirring sugar into his mug. He turned as I entered, that same steady calm behind his eyes. "Morning, Ethan," he said. "Sleep well?" "Mostly." "Good." He smiled faintly, like the word carried more weight than it should. The day unfolded in slow fragments. My father and Tom repaired a loose section of dock, their laughter echoing over the water. David cleaned fishing rods, humming tunelessly. Mark joined me near the boathouse, where we sorted through tangled ropes and rusted hooks. The air smelled of lakeweed and sun-warmed pine. "You used to come here often?" I asked. That he nodded. "Every summer, for a while." "Your dad, me, David, Tom. We thought the world began and ended at this lake." I looked at him. "And now?" "Now the world feels smaller." He smiled without looking up. "But memories make good company when the noise dies down." Something about the way he said it stayed with me, the hint of weariness behind the ease. His eyes were soft, but there was a gravity there, like he was speaking from a place far older than his years. By noon, the sun broke through, scattering gold across the water. We took the boat out, my father steering, Tom telling stories, David lounging with his feet over the edge. Mark sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders brushed when the boat tilted. Each touch, however small, seemed to last a beat too long. That my father didn't notice, or pretended not to. He talked about old times, names I didn't know, jokes that belonged to another generation. I laughed when expected, but the laughter didn't belong to me. At one point, Mark leaned closer and said quietly, "He doesn't see you clearly, does he?" I turned toward him, startled. "What do you mean?" "He looks at you and still sees a boy. But you've grown in ways he doesn't understand." I didn't answer. The air between us tightened, wordless but full. Later, when we returned, my father disappeared into the shed with Tom, leaving David to light the evening fire. Mark lingered near the porch, polishing a glass absently. "You don't talk much," he said after a while. "I guess I learned from my dad." He chuckled softly. "Maybe. But sometimes silence says more than words." The comment struck deeper than I expected. There was no flirtation in his tone, no teasing, just quiet observation. It made me feel seen in a way that was almost uncomfortable. When dinner came, conversation flowed like warm current, drinks poured, plates passed, laughter rebounding through the room. My father grew louder with every glass, the way men do when they mistake volume for control. Mark, in contrast, spoke sparingly. Each word deliberate, each glance precise. I found myself watching him, the curve of his hand around the glass, the way his voice softened when he addressed me. At one point, David leaned across the table and said, "You look just like your father did at your age, Ethan. Maybe a little less trouble, though." "Don't bet on it," Tom added, earning another round of laughter, but Mark's gaze didn't join the humor. He looked at me for a long moment, then down at his drink. The noise around us faded, and for a breath, it felt like there were only two people in that room. When the plates cleared, the others drifted toward the fire pit outside. The night was thick with the smell of rain, clouds rolling in over the lake. My father sat with Tom and David, trading stories too loud for the calm that surrounded them. Mark stayed behind, collecting bottles, his movements unhurried. "Storm's coming," he said. "I know." He nodded toward the window. "You can feel it in the air before it arrives, like everything's holding its breath." I stood beside him, close enough to hear the low rhythm of his breathing. The rain began as a whisper on the roof, then gathered strength, rattling against the glass. Lightning flared across the lake, white and brief. The power flickered once and died. The room fell into darkness, broken only by the faint glow from the fireplace outside. "Guess we're on candle duty," Mark said quietly. He found a box on the shelf, lit a single wick. The small flame painted his face in shifting gold, the light softening the sharpness of his features. For a while, we didn't speak. The silence wasn't empty, it pulsed with something fragile, unspoken. "Finally," he said, "you remind me of myself at your age." I glanced up. "That's supposed to be a compliment?" He smiled faintly. "Depends who's asking." I laughed, though it came out shaky. He turned to the window again, rain streaking down the glass like veins. "Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who never really see us," he said. "And sometimes the ones who do, aren't supposed to." The words lingered, low and dangerous. Before I could respond, the screen door opened and David's voice called out, "Mark, you hiding from the storm?" He turned away, the moment breaking cleanly, like glass underfoot. "Just waiting for it to pass," he answered. David grinned, stepping inside with a towel draped over his shoulders. "Good luck with that. It's going all night." They spoke easily, old friends resettling into rhythm. I stood back, caught between presence and retreat, unsure which direction to choose. When the lightning flashed again, Mark's eyes met mine across the dim room. There was no smile this time, just an acknowledgement, quiet and deliberate. Outside, thunder rolled across the lake. Inside, laughter rose again, masking what had almost been said. Hours later, after the others had drifted to bed, I found myself awake in the dark. The rain still pressed against the roof, soft and steady. Somewhere below, footsteps moved lightly, then stopped. For a moment, I thought of going down, to speak, to ask, to understand, but I stayed where I was, caught between fear and longing. The lake house groaned with the weight of the storm, its walls whispering with wind and memory. I closed my eyes, knowing something irreversible had begun. Though neither of us had crossed any line, something had shifted in the quiet between us. And even through the noise of the storm, I could still hear Mark's voice. Low, patient, dangerous in its truth. "Sometimes the ones who see us, aren't supposed to." Morning came pale and slow, the rain reduced to a mist that clung to the windows. The lake, once alive with motion, now lay still, its surface a dull mirror reflecting only gray. I woke to the sound of footsteps downstairs, low voices moving in and out of earshot. The air in the room felt heavy, as if the storm had left something behind that hadn't quite settled. When I stepped into the kitchen, my father was at the stove, frying bacon with mechanical precision. The others sat scattered, David nursing a cup of coffee, Tom reading something on his phone. Mark stood by the open door, breathing in the damp air. He turned when he sensed me. "Morning," he said softly, the word almost lost under the crackle of grease. "Morning," I replied, though my voice felt too small for the silence between us. Why father didn't look up. "We'll pack up after breakfast," he said. "Roads should be clear by noon." Something in his tone made it sound less like instruction and more like escape. The table talk was brief, clipped. Gone was the easy laughter of the previous night. The storm had washed away the warmth, leaving only fragments, glances, unfinished words, the dull rhythm of dishes being cleared. Afterward, my father and Tom disappeared outside to check the boat. David volunteered to gather firewood, though the rain had already soaked everything through. That left Mark and me in the quiet of the house, the sound of the lake brushing faintly against the dock that he was folding a blanket when he said, without looking at me, "Did you sleep?" "Not much." "Me neither." The air tightened. The silence was neither comfortable nor cold, it existed somewhere in between, alive but fragile. "I keep thinking about what you said last night," I began. "About being seen." Mark stopped folding. His eyes found mine, steady and unreadable. "You shouldn't," he said gently. "Sometimes words mean more in storms than they do in daylight." "Is that regret?" He smiled faintly. "It's perspective." He moved past me, carrying the blanket to the closet. The scent of rain and cedar trailed after him. When he turned back, there was something careful in his expression, an awareness of boundaries, and how close we stood to them. "Your father's a good man," he said after a pause. "But he's not an easy one." "I know. He keeps things inside until they rust." "So do you." He looked at me for a long time before saying, "Maybe that's why I recognized it." The sound of footsteps outside broke whatever had begun to form between us. My father's voice carried through the door, calling for help with the gear. Mark exhaled, almost in relief. "We should get moving," he said, and just like that, the moment dissolved that we worked in silence for the next hour, loading boxes, coiling ropes, checking the engine. The lake house seemed smaller in daylight, its corners stripped of mystery. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that something invisible had been left inside its walls, something that belonged to both of us now. When the car was finally packed, my father lingered by the porch, surveying the property like a man cataloging memories he no longer trusted. "We'll come back next season," he said to no one in particular. Tom grinned. "If this place hasn't fallen into the lake by then." David laughed. Mark didn't. He stood near the edge of the dock, hands in his pockets, watching the water ripple in slow circles. I hesitated before walking over. "You'll be heading back to the city?" I asked that. He nodded. "Work doesn't wait." "Will you see my dad again soon?" "Maybe. We always say we will." He looked at me then, his voice lowering. "Take care of yourself, Ethan. The world gets louder the older you get. Don't let it drown you out." I wanted to answer, but my throat closed around the words. Instead, I only nodded. When he reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder, it was brief, nothing that could be mistaken for more. Yet it felt like a punctuation mark, an ending he chose before I could not be. By the time I turned back toward the car, he was already walking away, the mist swallowing his outline. The drive home was quiet. My father kept his eyes on the road, both hands gripping the wheel. Once or twice he glanced at me, as though weighing something unsaid, but the words never came. "At one point," he said, "you seem to get along with Mark. He's easy to talk to. He's been through a lot. So have you." That ended the conversation. The rain returned briefly, tapping against the windshield like an unfinished thought that we reached home by dusk. The lake house felt far away, like a dream that fades even as you try to recall its details. My father carried his bag inside without another word. I watched him disappear into the hallway, his shadow swallowed by the dim light. That night, lying in my own bed, I replayed the weekend in fragments, the firelight on Mark's face, the sound of rain on the roof, the quiet way he'd said "take care of yourself." None of it made sense in linear time. It was memory, raw and disordered, the kind that grows heavier the more you hold it. That I didn't see Mark again. Not that year, not the next. My father kept in touch with his friends less often, the way people do when reminders of youth start to sting. Occasionally, I'd hear his name in passing, someone mentioning his promotion, or that he'd moved closer to the coast. I never asked for more, but sometimes, when I'd drive past a still body of water or catch the scent of rain on old wood, the memory returned, not as guilt, but as understanding. There are moments that shape you without demanding explanation. Moments that exist outside morality or intent. The lake house was one of those. So was Mark. Years later, I learned he'd sold his business and moved abroad. My father mentioned it offhand, as if discussing the weather. I nodded, said nothing, and that night I dreamed of the lake again, the same still water, the same pale light, but this time I was alone that I woke before dawn, the room half lit with the first trace of morning. Outside, the city was already stirring, horns, footsteps, the ordinary rhythm of life. I sat by the window for a while, the memory of that weekend pressing quietly at the edges of thought that I never told anyone what really happened, or didn't happen, at the lake house. Some truths aren't meant to be confessed. They live between words, in the pauses, in the looks that last a second too long. When people ask about my father's friends, I just say they were good men who loved the lake. It's simple, and mostly true, but every so often, when the air smells of storm and pine, I think of Mark's voice, calm and careful in the dark. Sometimes the ones who see us, aren't supposed to. He was right. Some forms of understanding arrive only once, and never ask to be repeated.